Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the smoky, golden world of medieval Russian beekeepers, where you're about to discover how these forest-dwelling craftsmen transformed wild honey into liquid matrimonial magic. Picture yourself standing in a birch grove at dawn, mist clinging to ancient tree trunks while the air hums with the drowsy buzz of 10,000 bees returning to their hollow log homes. The scent of wood smoke and fermented honey drifts through the air as you watch a weathered beekeeper emerge from his underground brewing chamber, clay vessels balanced in calloused hands. And honestly, you probably won't survive your first attempt at stealing honey from a wild hive without protective gear that won't be invented for another 6 centuries. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing our little global bedtime community come together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in the dense forests of medieval Rus, somewhere around the 12th century, where honey isn't just a sweetener, it's liquid gold, sacred currency, and the foundation of the most important beverage in Slavic culture. Long before sugarcane made its way north, honey was the only reliable source of concentrated sweetness, and the people of medieval Russia had elevated its use to an art form that would make modern craft brewers weep with envy. The ancient Slavs believed honey was a gift from the thunder god Perun himself, delivered through his sacred messengers, the bees. Archaeological evidence from Novgorod reveals that honey consumption in medieval Russia was roughly 10 times higher per capita than in Western Europe, partly because the vast northern forests provided perfect conditions for wild bee colonies, but mostly because honey wine, or medivuka, was considered essential for every major life event, especially weddings. You're witnessing the tail end of an ancient tradition that stretches back to the earliest Slavic settlements. Before Christianity arrived in 988 CE, pagan wedding ceremonies required the bride and groom to share honey wine as a binding ritual, literally drinking their marriage contract. The sweet, alcoholic beverage was believed to ensure fertility, prosperity, and protection from evil spirits, which explains why medieval Russian newlyweds consumed nothing but honey wine for the first month of marriage, giving us the term honeymoon. But here's where it gets interesting. Medieval Russian beekeeping wasn't the gentle, domesticated practice you might imagine. These weren't tidy wooden boxes in someone's backyard garden. You're dealing with wild bees living in natural tree hollows, sometimes 40 feet off the ground, guarded by swarms that viewed human honey thieves as existential threats worthy of death. The process of locating, claiming, and harvesting these aerial treasure troves required skills part tracker, part climber, part warrior, and part alchemist. Historians still argue whether the elaborate honey wine recipes were originally developed by pagan priests or early Christian monks, since both groups carefully guarded their brewing secrets. What we do know is that by the medieval period, the production of wedding honey wine had become a specialized craft requiring months of preparation, access to closely guarded ingredients, and timing so precise that entire village celebrations could be ruined by a week's miscalculation. The economic importance of honey wine cannot be overstated. In some regions, a master honey wine brewer commanded more respect and higher payment than the local blacksmith. Wedding contracts often specified not just the dowry and property arrangements, but exactly how much honey wine would be provided and by whom. A bride's family that couldn't supply adequate medivuka for the wedding feast faced genuine social disgrace, while a groom's family was expected to provide enough of the precious beverage to keep the celebration flowing for 3 days straight. You're about to embark on a year-long journey through the intricate process that transformed wild forest honey into the sacred wine that sealed medieval Russian marriages. From the spring scouting expeditions to locate productive bee colonies, through the terrifying autumn harvests conducted 40 feet above the forest floor, to the months-long fermentation process that required constant attention and arcane knowledge passed down through generations of brewmasters. The stakes were higher than you might think. Botch the fermentation, and you've not only wasted precious honey worth more than most people's annual income, but you've potentially ruined a wedding, dishonored 2 families, and maybe even cursed the newlyweds' future prosperity. No pressure, right? The medieval Russian beekeeper's year begins not in spring, but during the deepest freeze of February, when you're huddled beside a smoky hearth calculating lunar cycles and seasonal omens that will determine whether this year's honey wine will be worthy of a boyar's wedding or barely suitable for peasant festivities. You trace your finger along carved wooden calendar sticks, each notch representing crucial timing decisions that separate master brewers from amateur honey wasters who'll spend next winter explaining to angry fathers why their daughter's wedding wine tastes like fermented tree bark. The sacred bee calendar operates on principles that modern beekeepers would find utterly mystifying: a fusion of Orthodox Christian feast days, pagan lunar observations, and practical forest wisdom accumulated over centuries. Your brewing schedule must align with Saint Zosima's and Sebaceous Day on April 17th, the traditional blessing of beehives, but also with the ancient Slavic honeymoon cycles that dictate when wild bees are most productive and least homicidal. February's bone-deep cold serves a crucial purpose in honey wine production that has nothing to do with bees themselves. During these frozen months, you're preparing the wooden vessels, clay amphora, and underground cellars that will house your precious fermentation. The extreme cold naturally sanitizes equipment and kills harmful bacteria that could contaminate your honey wine, a process medieval brewers understood intuitively, though they couldn't explain the microbiology behind it. You spend these winter weeks studying the intricate relationship between moon phases and fermentation timing. Full moon harvests supposedly produce honey wine with stronger intoxicating effects, while new moon brewing creates gentler, sweeter varieties preferred for bride price negotiations. Whether there's actual scientific basis for these beliefs matters less than the fact that every successful honey wine brewer in medieval Russia swore by them, and customers could taste the difference. The most crucial calculation involves predicting the exact week when wild bee colonies will reach peak honey production, typically the 3rd or 4th week of August, but varying based on spring weather, flower blooms, and mysterious factors that experienced beekeepers claim to read in bee flight patterns. Get this timing wrong, and you'll either harvest immature honey that won't ferment properly, or arrive to find other beekeepers have already claimed the best hives. Here's where medieval Russian honey wine production gets genuinely bizarre. The calendar also accounts for bee wars, territorial conflicts between neighboring beekeepers that could escalate into actual violence. The Orthodox Church recorded numerous cases of honey thieves being beaten, occasionally killed, over disputed hive ownership. Your brewing calendar must factor in not just optimal harvesting conditions, but strategic timing to avoid confronting rival collectors who might be perfectly willing to push you out of that 40-foot oak tree. Spring preparation involves more than equipment maintenance. You're conducting reconnaissance missions through hundreds of square miles of forest, mapping the locations of productive wild hives, assessing their health, and establishing territorial claims that other beekeepers will hopefully respect. This isn't casual exploration. You're engaging in serious intelligence gathering that determines whether your brewing operation succeeds or fails. The bee calendar also incorporates orthodox fasting periods, during which consuming honey wine was forbidden but brewing it was perfectly acceptable. This created a peculiar scheduling dynamic where you'd spend Lent frantically producing honey wine you couldn't taste test until Easter, leading to some genuinely spectacular fermentation disasters when brewers misjudged their recipes. Medieval Russian beekeepers developed an almost supernatural ability to predict weather patterns months in advance, since honey wine production required coordinating multiple temperature-sensitive processes across an entire year. Too warm during fermentation storage, and your wine turns to vinegar. Too cold during initial brewing, and fermentation never begins. Too wet during honey harvest, and you're diluting the precious concentrated sugars that make fermentation possible. Historians still argue whether these elaborate calendar calculations actually improved honey wine quality, or simply provided psychological comfort to brewers attempting an inherently unpredictable process. What's undeniable is that the most successful medieval honey wine producers treated their calendars as sacred texts, consulted local wise women about auspicious timing, and occasionally postponed entire wedding celebrations rather than serve honey wine brewed on unlucky days. You're learning to think like a medieval Russian, where the boundary between practical knowledge and mystical wisdom dissolves completely. Your bee calendar isn't just scheduling, it's prophecy, science, and survival strategy rolled into one carved wooden artifact that determines your family's prosperity for the entire year. The February planning sessions also involve stockpiling materials that won't be available during peak production months: beeswax for sealing fermentation vessels, herbs and spices for flavoring, and most importantly, securing access to the pure spring water that transforms ordinary fermented honey into matrimonial magic worthy of sealing lifelong contracts between noble families. The spring forest expedition begins before dawn, when you're strapping on leather boots that will carry you through 50 miles of trackless wilderness in search of the hollow trees that house your liquid fortune. You shoulder a pack containing rope, climbing spikes, emergency food, and a small axe, not for cutting down trees, but for defending yourself against other honey hunters who might dispute your territorial claims with considerably more enthusiasm than medieval property law technically permits. Your first challenge involves reading the forest like a living map where every bent branch, bee flight pattern, and flower bloom provides crucial intelligence about hidden hive locations. Medieval Russian beekeepers developed tracking skills that would impress modern wilderness survival experts, following bee highways through dense canopy to locate colonies that might be completely invisible from ground level. You watch for bees carrying pollen back toward their homes, noting the angle of their flight and the species of flowers they're visiting. The most productive wild hives typically establish themselves in ancient oak or linden trees, 40 to 60 feet above the ground, accessible only through dangerous climbing that kills several honey hunters every season. You're looking for telltale signs: dark stains on bark where bees have expelled waste, small holes in tree trunks that serve as hive entrances, and the distinctive humming that indicates a large, healthy colony worth the considerable risk of harvesting. But here's where medieval honey hunting gets genuinely cutthroat. The best hive locations are jealously guarded secrets passed down through families for generations, and territorial disputes over particularly productive trees occasionally escalated into blood feuds lasting decades. You're not just exploring, you're engaging in a high-stakes game where wrong moves can result in sabotaged equipment, stolen honey, or having your climbing ropes mysteriously cut while you're 40 feet off the ground. The forest expedition also serves as quality assessment for this year's honey crop. Different tree species and flower varieties produce dramatically different honey flavors, and medieval Russian wedding clients had sophisticated preferences that determined pricing. Linden honey commands premium prices for its delicate floral notes, while buckwheat honey, darker and more robust, was preferred for longer fermentation periods that produced stronger alcohol content. You spend weeks mapping not just hive locations, but the complex territorial agreements between neighboring beekeepers. Some trees are claimed by ancient right, passed down through generations and defended with genuine violence. Others operate under informal sharing arrangements where multiple hunters harvest from the same general area without direct conflict. The most valuable locations require tribute payments to local landowners or monastery officials who control access to the most productive forest regions. Medieval Russian forest law regarding wild hives was remarkably sophisticated, recognizing different categories of ownership based on who first discovered the colony, who improved the tree to make harvesting easier, and who consistently maintained the area around productive hives. You need to understand these legal complexities because violating established territorial agreements could result in having your entire year's honey harvest confiscated by local authorities. The spring reconnaissance also involves assessing each colony's health and productivity potential. Experienced beekeepers could estimate a hive's honey production capacity by observing bee behavior, flight patterns, and seasonal activity levels. A strong colony might produce 60 pounds of surplus honey available for harvest, while weaker hives yield barely enough to justify the dangerous climbing required to reach them. Weather prediction becomes crucial during these forest expeditions, since honey production depends heavily on rainfall, temperature, and flowering schedules that vary dramatically from year to year. You're learning to read environmental signs that indicate whether this will be a banner honey year or one of those disasters that forces you to dilute precious reserves with inferior honey purchased from distant regions. Historians still argue whether the territorial violence surrounding medieval honey hunting was primarily economic or reflected deeper cultural beliefs about forest spirits and sacred groves. What's certain is that many beekeepers carried weapons during forest expeditions, and local court records document numerous cases of honey theft, resulting in serious injuries or death. The expedition concludes with marking your claimed territories using traditional symbols carved into bark or arranged stones that other beekeepers would recognize and hopefully respect. These territorial markers represented months of dangerous work and significant investment in climbing equipment, and destroying someone else's claim markers was considered grounds for immediate and violent retaliation. You return from the spring forest expedition with detailed mental maps of dozens of potential hive locations, assessment of their productive capacity, and strategic plans for avoiding territorial conflicts with rival honey hunters. But the real work hasn't even begun. You've simply identified the aerial treasure troves that will require death-defying autumn harvests to transform into wedding wine worthy of sealing noble marriage contracts. Remember that sacred bee calendar from February? Every decision you've made during this forest expedition must align with those lunar calculations and seasonal timing predictions, because the window for optimal honey harvesting lasts only a few weeks, and missing it means explaining to wedding clients why their matrimonial wine tastes like disappointment fermented in regret. Your workshop fills with the rhythmic hammering of metal on wood as you craft the specialized tools that separate successful honey hunters from those who return empty-handed, stung beyond recognition, or don't return at all. Medieval Russian beekeeping required equipment that modern hobbyists would find laughably primitive yet ingeniously adapted to the unique challenges of harvesting honey from wild colonies living 40 feet above the forest floor. The smoking pot represents your most crucial piece of equipment, a clay vessel with carefully designed ventilation holes that produce the thick, cool smoke necessary to calm angry bee colonies without killing them. You're not just burning any available wood. Medieval honey hunters developed sophisticated knowledge of which tree species produce smoke with the right density, temperature, and chemical properties to pacify bees effectively. Birch bark creates thick, white smoke that bees find soothing, while rotted oak produces a heavier smoke that penetrates deeper into hive cavities. Constructing climbing gear from available medieval materials requires engineering skills that would challenge modern rock climbers. You're braiding rope from hemp fibers, creating climbing spikes from hand-forged iron, and designing harnesses from leather strips that must support your full body weight, while leaving hands free for the delicate work of honey extraction. One equipment failure 40 feet up a tree means certain death, so every knot, every metal joint, every leather connection gets tested beyond reasonable limits. The honey collection vessels demand particularly careful construction, since they must be lightweight enough for aerial work yet sturdy enough to hold 60 pounds of liquid honey during a controlled descent from treetop hives. You craft them from thin wood strips bound with iron hoops, waterproofed with pine resin, and fitted with secure lids that prevent precious honey from spilling during the inevitable swaying and bumping of tree climbing expeditions. Here's where medieval Russian ingenuity gets genuinely impressive. You're also constructing portable workbenches that can be hauled up trees and assembled at height, providing stable platforms for the intricate work of honey extraction. These aren't simple platforms. They're sophisticated pieces of engineering with adjustable supports that accommodate different tree trunk diameters and branch configurations. The protective clothing available to medieval honey hunters was simultaneously laughably inadequate and surprisingly effective. You layer thick woolen garments, wrap exposed skin with linen strips, and create face masks from leather with narrow eye slits that provide vision while preventing bees from reaching vulnerable areas. The goal isn't complete protection. That's impossible with medieval materials, but rather reducing bee stings from potentially fatal numbers to merely excruciating but survivable quantities. Tool maintenance becomes a matter of life and death when your equipment must function perfectly in life-threatening situations. You spend hours sharpening climbing spikes, testing rope connections, and examining every piece of gear for where that could cause catastrophic failure. Medieval honey hunters developed obsessive equipment inspection routines that modern safety engineers would recognize and approve. The workshop also produces specialized containers for transporting raw honey back to brewing facilities without contamination or spillage. These vessels require precise construction, too porous, and honey leaks out, too airtight, and fermentation begins prematurely during transport. You're creating containers that must maintain honey quality during multi-day journeys through rough terrain while protecting their precious contents from moisture, dirt, and opportunistic thieves. Medieval Russian beekeepers also crafted ingenious devices for accessing hives located in particularly difficult tree configurations. Extending poles with hooks for retrieving honeycomb, pulley systems for hauling heavy loads to ground level, and even primitive ladders that could be assembled from portable components and secured to tree trunks using rope and spike combinations. Historians still argue whether the elaborate tool-making rituals surrounding honey hunting served practical purposes or reflected deeper spiritual beliefs about forest magic and bee-human relationships. What's certain is that successful honey hunters treated their equipment with reverence bordering on worship, often blessing tools before dangerous expeditions and maintaining them with obsessive care that ensured decades of reliable service. The financial investment in proper honey hunting equipment was staggering by medieval standards. A complete set of professional quality tools cost more than most peasants earned in an entire year. This economic barrier meant that honey hunting remained concentrated among specialists who could afford the equipment and possessed the skills necessary to use it without dying in the attempt. You're also preparing backup equipment, because tool failure during honey harvest season meant losing an entire year's income. Spare ropes, replacement smoking pot components, and backup climbing gear were essential insurance against the equipment failures that could transform a profitable honey hunting expedition into a financial disaster. The final stage involves testing all equipment under controlled conditions, practicing climbing techniques, and rehearsing the complex procedures required for safe honey extraction. You can't afford to learn these skills while hanging 40 feet above ground with thousands of angry bees questioning your life choices. So every movement, every tool manipulation, gets practiced until it becomes automatic muscle memory. August's oppressive heat transforms the forest into a cathedral of humming tension as you approach your first target tree, climbing gear secured and smoking pot billowing the thick birch smoke that hopefully convinces 10,000 agitated bees that you're not worth their collective homicidal attention. The honey extraction process represents the culmination of months of preparation, requiring split-second timing, nerves of steel, and acceptance that you're about to engage in behavior that any reasonable person would classify as elaborate suicide with occasional profit margins. Your ascent begins in pre-dawn darkness, when cooler temperatures keep bee activity at manageable levels and thick morning mist provides additional cover for your approach. The climbing technique developed by medieval Russian honey hunters involved a combination of rope work, iron spikes driven into bark, and sheer upper body strength that would challenge modern rock climbers. You're hauling 60 pounds of equipment up a vertical surface while maintaining perfect balance, because falling means death and dropping your tools means financial ruin. The first glimpse into the hive cavity reveals whether this particular tree will justify the considerable risk you're taking. Premium colonies produce honeycomb structures that gleam like amber architecture, thick with concentrated nectar that will ferment into honey wine worthy of boyar weddings. Lesser hives contain thin, watery honey barely suitable for peasant celebrations, and you must make instant decisions about whether to proceed with dangerous extraction or abandon this tree for more promising targets. Here's where the medieval honey harvest gets genuinely terrifying. You're working with thousands of insects whose evolutionary programming identifies you as an existential threat requiring immediate and violent response. Even with thick smoke providing temporary pacification, bee stings are inevitable. A few dozen stings cause painful but manageable swelling, but experienced honey hunters regularly endured hundreds of stings during major extractions, occasionally requiring medical treatment for severe allergic reactions. The extraction technique itself requires surgical precision executed under the most stressful conditions imaginable. You're removing honeycomb sections using sharp knives while maintaining perfect balance 40 feet above ground, carefully preserving comb structure that contains both honey and developing bee larvae. Medieval Russian honey hunters learned to distinguish between honeycomb ready for harvest and sections that should remain undisturbed to ensure colony survival for future years. Quality control during extraction was crucial, since contaminated or inferior honey would ruin entire batches of wedding wine. You're examining each section of comb for signs of disease, moisture content that indicates proper ripeness, and color variations that affect final honey wine flavor. Dark, robust honey from late-season flowers produces stronger, more alcoholic wines, while pale early-season honey creates delicate varieties preferred for ceremonial toasts. The logistical challenge of lowering 60 pounds of liquid honey from treetop height without spillage required ingenious rope and pulley systems that medieval engineers would have found impressive. You're managing multiple containers, coordinating with ground assistants, and maintaining perfect timing to prevent honey crystallization that begins immediately upon exposure to cooler air temperatures. Medieval Russian honey hunters also practiced sustainable harvesting techniques that ensured wild colonies remained productive for decades. You're taking only surplus honey stores, leaving enough reserves for the colony to survive winter, and avoiding damage to brood chambers where new bees develop. This conservation ethic wasn't environmental consciousness. It was economic necessity, since destroying productive hives meant losing future income. The physical toll of honey extraction was severe enough that most professionals retired by age 40, their bodies worn down by decades of dangerous climbing, bee stings, and the constant stress of working at fatal heights. Many honey hunters bore permanent scars from climbing accidents, bee attack injuries, and equipment failures that provided painful reminders of their profession's inherent dangers. Historians still argue whether medieval honey hunters used primitive protective gear or relied entirely on smoke and quick reflexes to avoid the worst bee attacks. Archaeological evidence suggests some combination of thick clothing and leather masks, but the effectiveness of such protection remains debatable given the limited materials available. The harvest concludes with the delicate descent, honey-laden containers secured and balanced to prevent disasters that could destroy an entire day's dangerous work. You're managing equipment, maintaining climbing safety, and protecting precious honey from contamination or spillage during the ground-level transition that transforms raw forest honey into the foundation material for sacred wedding wine. Weather conditions during harvest were absolutely critical. Rain diluted honey quality, excessive heat caused premature fermentation, and wind made tree climbing impossibly dangerous. Medieval honey hunters developed almost supernatural abilities to predict weather changes, often abandoning partially completed extractions when atmospheric conditions threatened disaster. Remember those territorial disputes from spring reconnaissance? Harvest season was when diplomatic honey hunting agreements occasionally broke down into open warfare, with rival collectors sabotaging each other's equipment, stealing partially extracted honey, or engaging in actual physical confrontations over disputed tree ownership rights. The monastery gates swing open before dawn as you approach the weathered stone walls where Orthodox monks have perfected the arcane art of transforming raw forest honey into divine matrimonial wine through fermentation secrets jealously guarded for centuries. Brother Sergius beckons you into candlelit cellars where clay vessels bubble with mysterious alchemy, and the air hangs thick with the sweet, yeasty aroma of honey wine undergoing the sacred transformation from simple bee nectar into liquid capable of sealing lifelong marriage contracts between noble families. Medieval Russian monasteries became the unlikely centers of honey wine innovation because monks possessed several crucial advantages over secular brewers: literacy for recording precise recipes, access to imported spices and herbs unavailable to common beekeepers, and most importantly, the patience required for fermentation processes that could take months or even years to reach perfection. The monastery of St. Sergius near Moscow developed honey wine recipes so sophisticated that princes traveled hundreds of miles to commission special batches for royal weddings. Brother Sergius leads you through underground chambers carved directly into bedrock, where consistent temperatures and humidity levels create perfect conditions for controlled fermentation. These aren't casual storage areas. They're precision-engineered environments that maintain exactly the atmospheric conditions necessary for transforming honey into wine without the spoilage that ruins amateur brewing attempts. The monks understood fermentation science centuries before anyone could explain the biological processes involved. The monastic approach to honey wine production incorporated orthodox theological principles that elevated brewing from craft to spiritual practice. Specific prayers were recited during each stage of production, holy water was added to fermentation vessels, and the timing of various processes aligned with religious calendar observances. Whether these spiritual elements actually improved wine quality or simply provided psychological comfort to nervous brewers, the results spoke for themselves. Monastery honey wine commanded premium prices and customer loyalty that lasted generations. Here's where monastery brewing gets genuinely sophisticated. The monks developed standardized measurement systems that eliminated the guesswork plaguing secular honey wine production. While village brewers relied on intuition and rough approximations, monastic recipes specified exact ratios of honey to water, precise timing for each fermentation stage, and detailed quality control procedures that ensured consistent results batch after batch. The monks also pioneered the use of exotic additives that transformed simple fermented honey into complex beverages worthy of diplomatic gifts. Cinnamon imported from Constantinople, cloves from distant spice routes, and rare herbs gathered from monastery gardens created flavor profiles that distinguished monastic honey wine from the rougher varieties produced by forest beekeepers. These ingredients were expensive enough that their inclusion represented significant financial investment in each batch. Temperature control represented perhaps the monks' greatest technical achievement in honey wine production. The underground cellars maintained temperatures within the narrow range necessary for optimal fermentation, too warm, and the process proceeded too quickly, producing harsh flavors, too cool, and fermentation stalled completely. Medieval monks developed sophisticated ventilation systems and thermal management techniques that wouldn't be out of place in modern brewing facilities. The monastic fermentation vessels themselves were masterpieces of medieval ceramic engineering, designed with specific shapes and glazes that promoted proper yeast activity while preventing contamination. These weren't simple clay pots. They were precision instruments crafted by specialist potters working to monastery specifications, often taking months to produce and costing more than most families' annual income. Monastery record-keeping revolutionized honey wine production by documenting which techniques produced superior results, and which variations led to disaster. While secular brewers relied on oral tradition that could be lost or corrupted over generations, the monks maintained detailed written records that allowed for continuous improvement and quality control that was unprecedented in medieval beverage production. The most closely guarded monastic secrets involved yeast cultivation techniques that ensured reliable fermentation even during harsh winters when wild yeasts became inactive. Historians still argue whether medieval monks understood the biological role of yeast or simply developed empirical methods that worked consistently. What's certain is that monastery honey wine rarely suffered from the fermentation failures that plagued amateur brewers. Brother Sergius demonstrates the monastery's signature technique for clarifying honey wine through multiple filtration stages using materials ranging from fine linen cloth to crushed eggshells that somehow remove impurities while preserving delicate flavors. This clarification process could take weeks and required constant attention, but it produced honey wine so clear and pure that customers claimed they could taste the difference between batches made from different types of forest flowers. The monks also developed aging techniques that improved honey wine quality over periods measured in years rather than months. Special storage vessels, precise environmental controls, and mysterious additives that prevented spoilage during extended aging created vintage honey wines that commanded astronomical prices and were reserved for the most important political and religious ceremonies. Quality control in monastery production involved taste testing protocols that would impress modern beverage scientists. Senior monks developed palates capable of detecting subtle flavor variations, contamination, or fermentation problems that might not become apparent to casual drinkers until the wine had already spoiled. This expertise made monastery honey wine virtually guaranteed to meet customer expectations, establishing reputations that lasted centuries. The pilgrimage to sacred springs begins at midnight, when you're carrying empty vessels through moonlit forests toward water sources blessed by Orthodox saints and filtered through limestone caverns that medieval brewers believed possessed miraculous properties essential for transforming ordinary honey into matrimonial wine worthy of sealing noble marriage contracts. The spring of St. Seraphim, hidden deep in the Arzemas forests, produces water so pure that honey wine brewed with it supposedly grants fertility and marital happiness, making it worth the dangerous 3-day journey through bandit-infested wilderness. Water quality represented the single most critical factor determining honey wine's success or failure, since inferior water would ruin the most expensive honey and destroy months of careful preparation. Medieval Russian brewers developed sophisticated knowledge of which springs produced water suitable for fermentation, which sources contained minerals that enhanced flavor, and which wells were contaminated with substances that would kill yeast cultures before fermentation could begin. The sacred water collection process involved elaborate purification rituals that combined Orthodox Christian prayers with older pagan traditions honoring water spirits and forest deities. You're not simply filling containers, you're participating in ceremonies that supposedly imbue the water with spiritual properties necessary for producing honey wine capable of blessing marriages and ensuring family prosperity. Whether these rituals actually improved water quality or simply provided psychological comfort to nervous brewers, the results were undeniable. Honey wine made with blessed water commanded premium prices. Here's where medieval water sourcing gets genuinely dangerous. The best springs were often located in remote wilderness areas controlled by bandits, wild animals, or territorial disputes between rival monasteries. Water collection expeditions required armed escorts, diplomatic negotiations with local authorities, and careful timing to avoid seasonal conflicts that could transform peaceful pilgrimages into military campaigns. The herb-gathering component of ingredient sourcing required botanical knowledge that rivaled university-trained physicians of the medieval period. You're identifying dozens of plant species that enhance honey wine flavor, promote fermentation, or provide supposed medicinal benefits for wedding couples. Meadowsweet for delicate floral notes, juniper berries for preservation, and mysterious herbs whose names were known only to master brewers who guarded their recipes with lethal seriousness. Medieval Russian honey wine producers also incorporated exotic spices that arrived through Byzantine trade routes, transforming local forest honey into cosmopolitan beverages that reflected the cultural sophistication of their clientele. Cardamom seeds from India, pepper from Southeast Asia, and precious saffron worth more than gold created flavor combinations that distinguished premium wedding wines from ordinary village varieties. The timing of ingredient collection was governed by lunar cycles, Orthodox feast days, and seasonal availability that created narrow windows for gathering materials at peak potency. Missing the optimal collection period meant either waiting an entire year or accepting inferior ingredients that would compromise final wine quality. An unacceptable risk when preparing honey wine for noble weddings where failure could result in social disgrace or actual violence. Preservation techniques for gathered herbs and spices required knowledge that bordered on medieval chemistry, involving careful drying, specific storage conditions, and mysterious treatments that prevented spoilage during the months-long period between collection and actual brewing. You're creating ingredient stockpiles that must remain potent through harsh winters and humid summers while maintaining the exact properties necessary for successful honey wine production. The economic value of premium ingredients created a shadow economy of specialized traders who supplied materials unavailable to ordinary beekeepers. Byzantine merchants, monastery connections, and dangerous wilderness expeditions provided access to rare substances that transformed basic honey wine into luxury beverages worthy of diplomatic gifts and royal celebrations. Quality control for ingredients involved testing procedures that medieval brewers developed through generations of trial and error. Water sources were evaluated for taste, clarity, and mysterious properties that experienced brewers claimed to detect through methods that seem almost supernatural to modern observers. Herbs were examined for color, aroma, and potency indicators that determined their suitability for high-stakes honey wine production. Historians still argue whether the elaborate ingredient sourcing rituals actually improved honey wine quality, or simply justified the premium prices charged for wedding beverages. What's certain is that customers could taste differences between honey wines made with ordinary ingredients versus those crafted with blessed water and exotic spices, creating market demand that supported the considerable expense and risk involved in premium ingredient procurement. The ingredient sourcing network also served intelligence-gathering functions, since traders and pilgrims who traveled to distant springs brought news about political developments, weather patterns, and market conditions that affected honey wine production and sales. Your water pilgrimage wasn't just ingredient gathering, it was economic espionage that provided competitive advantages in the cutthroat world of medieval luxury beverage production. Storage facilities for precious ingredients required security measures that resembled military installations more than typical medieval workshops. Locked chambers, armed guards, and elaborate concealment techniques protected stockpiles worth more than most people's lifetime earnings from theft, sabotage, or simple deterioration that could destroy an entire year's brewing potential. Remember those monastery brewing secrets from Brother Sergius? The advanced techniques monks developed for ingredient processing and preservation often leaked into secular brewing through former novices who left religious life but retained technical knowledge that gave them competitive advantages in commercial honey wine production. The excavation begins at dawn as you break ground for the underground fermentation chamber that will house your precious honey wine through the months-long transformation from raw ingredients into matrimonial magic, digging through frozen earth and bedrock to create the temperature-controlled environment that separates successful brewing operations from expensive disasters that leave wedding parties toasting with bitter disappointment. Your cellar must maintain precisely the atmospheric conditions necessary for controlled fermentation while protecting valuable honey wine from theft, contamination, and the extreme temperature fluctuations that could destroy months of dangerous work. Medieval Russian brewing cellars represented sophisticated engineering projects that required understanding principles of thermodynamics, structural stability, and environmental control that wouldn't be out of place in modern industrial facilities. You're not simply digging a hole, you're constructing a precision instrument designed to maintain temperatures within the narrow range necessary for optimal yeast activity while preventing the moisture problems that could ruin entire batches of honey wine. The construction process begins with site selection based on drainage patterns, soil composition, and proximity to water sources while maintaining sufficient distance from living areas to prevent honey wine aromas from attracting unwanted attention from thieves, bears, or local authorities who might demand taxation on luxury beverage production. The ideal location provides natural insulation from temperature extremes while offering discreet access for the secretive operations that characterize high-stakes honey wine brewing. Here's where medieval cellar construction gets genuinely impressive. You're creating ventilation systems using clay pipes and wooden channels that provide air circulation without compromising temperature control. Too much ventilation, and your carefully maintained brewing environment becomes subject to external weather fluctuations. Too little, and fermentation gases build up to dangerous levels that could kill anyone entering the chamber during active brewing periods. The foundation construction involves laying stone floors with subtle slopes that direct condensation away from fermentation vessels while preventing standing water that could harbor bacteria or mold that would contaminate precious honey wine. Medieval builders understood drainage engineering principles through practical experience, creating cellar systems that remained dry and functional for decades despite the constant moisture generated by active fermentation processes. Wall construction required materials that provided insulation while remaining resistant to the humidity and chemical conditions present during honey wine production. Clay-lined stone walls created thermal mass that buffered temperature fluctuations while preventing moisture penetration that could destabilize the entire structure. The most sophisticated cellars incorporated double-wall construction with insulating materials that maintained stable internal conditions regardless of surface weather variations. The storage system design involved creating specialized niches and shelving arrangements that accommodated different types of fermentation vessels while providing easy access for monitoring and maintenance during the critical brewing period. You're organizing space for dozens of clay amphora, wooden barrels, and sealed containers that must remain undisturbed for months while allowing regular inspection for contamination, proper fermentation progress, and quality control procedures. Medieval Russian cellar builders also incorporated security features that protected valuable honey wine from theft during the vulnerable fermentation period when interrupting the process could destroy entire batches. Hidden entrances, deceptive storage arrangements, and occasionally elaborate trap systems defended brewing operations worth more than most families' annual income from criminals who viewed honey wine cellars as particularly attractive targets. Temperature regulation represented the most critical aspect of cellar design, requiring techniques that maintained consistent conditions without access to modern heating or cooling systems. Strategic placement of thermal mass, insulation materials, and ventilation controls created environments that remained within acceptable temperature ranges despite seasonal weather extremes that could vary by 60 degrees or more. The cellar construction timeline had to coordinate with honey harvest schedules and fermentation timing, since delays in completion could force brewing operations to proceed in suboptimal conditions that compromised final honey wine quality. You're managing construction crews, material sourcing, and technical installation, while maintaining the precise scheduling necessary for successful honey wine production. Historians still argue whether the elaborate cellar construction techniques developed by medieval Russian brewers represented indigenous engineering innovations or adaptations of Byzantine architectural knowledge transmitted through monastery connections. What's certain is that the most successful honey wine producers invested enormous resources in cellar construction that provided competitive advantages lasting for generations. The final construction phase involved testing environmental controls, calibrating temperature regulation systems, and conducting trial fermentation batches that validated cellar performance before risking precious honey and expensive ingredients on full-scale production. These test runs often revealed design flaws that required expensive modifications or complete reconstruction of critical systems. Ventilation management during active fermentation required understanding gas dynamics that medieval builders developed through empirical observation rather than theoretical knowledge. Carbon dioxide produced during fermentation could create deadly atmospheric conditions, while excessive air circulation introduced contamination risks that could destroy valuable honey wine during the most vulnerable production phases. The economic investment in proper cellar construction was staggering by medieval standards. A professional quality brewing facility cost more than most people earned in several years. This financial barrier meant that serious honey wine production remained concentrated among specialists who could afford the infrastructure investment and possessed the technical knowledge necessary to operate sophisticated brewing facilities. Remember those sacred waters and blessed ingredients from your pilgrimage expeditions? The cellar design must accommodate the special storage requirements for premium materials while providing the controlled access necessary for maintaining ingredient quality during the extended brewing process that transforms forest honey into wedding wine worthy of sealing noble marriage contracts. The yeast cultivation laboratory occupies a corner of your cellar where clay vessels bubble with mysterious cultures that represent the living heart of honey wine production. Requiring constant attention and arcane knowledge passed down through generations of brewers who understood fermentation biology centuries before anyone could explain the microscopic processes that transform simple honey into intoxicating matrimonial wine. Your yeast starter cultures are more valuable than gold, since losing them means months of experimentation to develop new strains while wedding clients grow increasingly impatient with delays that could ruin their carefully planned celebrations. Medieval Russian brewers developed yeast cultivation techniques that modern microbiologists would find impressively sophisticated, creating and maintaining pure cultures through methods that relied on empirical observation rather than theoretical understanding of the biological mechanisms involved. You're managing living organisms whose health and activity determine whether your honey wine ferments properly or becomes expensive vinegar that forces you to explain fermentation failures to angry noble families. The capture of wild yeasts began during late summer when naturally occurring fermentation organisms were most active and diverse, providing opportunities to isolate strains particularly well suited to honey wine production. You're creating yeast traps using honey water solutions exposed to ambient air currents, then carefully evaluating which captured cultures produce the most desirable fermentation characteristics during controlled testing procedures. Here's where medieval yeast cultivation gets genuinely complex. Different yeast strains produce dramatically different honey wine flavors, alcohol content, and fermentation speeds, requiring master brewers to maintain multiple cultures for various wedding wine applications. High alcohol strains for celebratory toasting, slow fermenting varieties for delicate ceremonial wines, and robust cultures capable of surviving harsh winter conditions when brewing operations continued despite freezing temperatures. The yeast maintenance routine involved feeding cultures with precisely measured honey solutions, monitoring fermentation activity through visual and aromatic indicators, and conducting regular transfers to fresh vessels that prevented contamination while maintaining optimal growth conditions. You're essentially operating a medieval biotechnology laboratory using techniques that ensured yeast viability across seasons when fermentation activity naturally declined. Storage techniques for yeast cultures required understanding preservation methods that kept organisms viable during periods when active brewing wasn't occurring. Medieval brewers developed drying procedures, honey-based storage media, and temperature-controlled preservation techniques that maintained yeast cultures through harsh winters when normal fermentation activity would have ceased completely. The most closely guarded trade secrets involved yeast strain selection and improvement techniques that enhanced desirable characteristics while eliminating problems that caused fermentation failures. Master brewers could identify superior yeast cultures through subtle indicators that took decades of experience to recognize, creating competitive advantages that established brewing dynasties lasting for generations. Quality control for yeast cultures involved testing procedures that evaluated fermentation speed, alcohol production capacity, and flavor development characteristics before risking precious honey on full-scale brewing operations. You're conducting miniature fermentation trials that predicted how different yeast strains would perform during actual honey wine production, preventing disasters that could destroy months of dangerous honey harvesting work. Medieval Russian brewers also practiced primitive genetic selection by isolating and propagating yeast cultures that demonstrated superior performance characteristics, essentially conducting evolutionary breeding programs that improved honey wine quality over successive generations. These selection techniques created regional yeast varieties that produced distinctive local honey wine styles recognized by connoisseurs throughout medieval Russia. The economic value of superior yeast cultures created underground markets where master brewers traded, sold, or occasionally stole particularly desirable strains from competitors. Yeast theft was considered a serious crime in some regions, since losing established cultures could destroy brewing operations that represented enormous financial investments and years of careful development work. Temperature management for yeast cultivation required precise environmental control that maintained optimal growth conditions while preventing the overheating or cooling that could kill delicate cultures. You're operating multiple fermentation vessels at different temperatures, creating microclimates that supported various yeast strains with different environmental preferences and growth requirements. Historians still argue whether medieval Russian brewers understood that yeast were living organisms or simply developed empirical techniques that worked reliably without theoretical knowledge of fermentation biology. What's certain is that successful honey wine producers treated their yeast cultures with reverence bordering on religious devotion, often blessing cultures and conducting rituals intended to ensure their continued viability. The contamination prevention protocols involved sterilization techniques using boiling water, alcohol washes, and mysterious treatments that eliminated harmful bacteria while preserving beneficial yeast cultures. Medieval brewers understood cleanliness principles that prevented contamination even though they couldn't explain the microbiology behind their successful sanitation procedures. Yeast culture backup systems ensured that brewing operations could survive disasters that might destroy primary cultures, creating redundant storage arrangements and distribution networks that protected valuable strains against theft, contamination, or accidental destruction. You're maintaining multiple locations for critical yeast cultures, essentially operating biological insurance systems that guaranteed brewing continuity. Remember those monastery brewing secrets from Brother Sergius? The advanced yeast cultivation techniques developed by Orthodox monks often provided the foundation for secular brewing operations, since former novices carried technical knowledge that gave them significant advantages in commercial honey wine production where yeast management separated professional brewers from amateur enthusiasts. The sacred recipe emerges from months of preparation as you finally combine your forest-harvested honey, blessed spring water, and carefully cultivated yeast cultures in precise proportions that transform raw ingredients into the matrimonial wine that will seal noble marriage contracts with liquid gold worthy of boyar wedding celebrations. The measurements must be exact. Too much honey creates wine so sweet it masks the delicate floral notes that distinguish premium varieties, while too little produces weak, watery beverages that insult wedding guests and dishonor the families involved in these elaborate social contracts. Medieval Russian honey wine recipes operated on proportional systems that modern brewers would find surprisingly sophisticated, specifying exact ratios based on honey density, water purity, and seasonal variations that affected fermentation timing and final alcohol content. The master recipe calls for 12 pounds of premium linden honey dissolved in 4 gallons of blessed spring water, creating the precise sugar concentration necessary for proper yeast activity without overwhelming the delicate fermentation process. The honey preparation stage requires heating techniques that extract maximum flavor while avoiding the caramelization that would alter the wine's character and color. You're warming honey to exactly the temperature that allows smooth dissolution without destroying the volatile aromatic compounds that provide the floral complexity distinguishing premium wedding wines from ordinary village varieties. Too much heat ruins months of dangerous honey harvesting, while insufficient warming creates mixing problems that prevent proper fermentation. Here's where the medieval brewing process gets genuinely technical. Water temperature must coordinate precisely with honey preparation timing to create optimal conditions for yeast introduction. The blessed spring water gets heated separately to eliminate harmful bacteria while preserving mineral content that enhances fermentation, then cooled to the exact temperature that promotes rapid yeast growth without shocking the delicate cultures you've spent months cultivating. The yeast introduction ceremony combines practical brewing technique with orthodox religious ritual, since medieval Russian brewers believed spiritual blessing was as important as technical precision for ensuring successful fermentation. You're adding carefully measured amounts of active yeast culture while reciting prayers that supposedly sanctify the brewing process and guarantee wedding wine worthy of sealing sacred marriage bonds. Fermentation monitoring requires skills that border on medieval chemistry, involving daily observation of bubble patterns, aroma development, and color changes that indicate whether the brewing process proceeds normally or requires emergency intervention to prevent expensive disasters. The primary fermentation stage lasts approximately 3 weeks, during which you're essentially operating a biotechnology laboratory using techniques passed down through generations of master brewers. The recipe also specifies exact timing for spice additions that create the complex flavor profiles distinguishing different grades of wedding wine. Cinnamon and cloves added during early fermentation produce robust, warming wines suitable for winter celebrations, while delicate herbs introduced during secondary fermentation create subtle flavors preferred for spring weddings and diplomatic ceremonies. Quality control during brewing involves taste testing procedures that evaluate fermentation progress without contaminating the batch or exposing precious wine to harmful bacteria. You're developing palate sensitivity that can detect subtle flavor variations, potential contamination problems, and fermentation timing issues that might not become apparent until it's too late to salvage the entire batch. Temperature regulation during active fermentation requires constant attention to environmental conditions that affect yeast activity and flavor development. Medieval brewers understood that temperature fluctuations could stress yeast cultures, alter fermentation timing, or create off flavors that would make expensive honey wine unsuitable for noble wedding celebrations where beverage quality reflected family honor and social status. The secondary fermentation phase involves transferring partially completed wine to clean vessels while leaving sediment behind, essentially clarifying the wine while allowing continued fermentation that develops final alcohol content and flavor complexity. This racking process requires timing precision that prevents contamination while ensuring complete fermentation that produces stable wine capable of surviving storage until wedding celebrations. Historians still argue whether medieval Russian honey wine recipes were developed through systematic experimentation or evolved through generations of trial and error brewing that gradually refined techniques through practical experience. What's certain is that successful wedding wine commanded premium prices that justified the considerable investment in ingredients, equipment, and technical expertise required for consistent quality production. The recipe variations for different social classes created a hierarchy of honey wine quality that reflected medieval Russian social structure. Peasant wedding wines used rougher honey and simpler techniques that produced serviceable but unremarkable beverages, while noble celebrations demanded premium ingredients and advanced brewing methods that created wines worthy of diplomatic gifts and royal ceremonies. Storage requirements during fermentation involve maintaining precisely controlled conditions that prevent spoilage while allowing proper aging that develops the complex flavors characterizing mature honey wine. You're managing multiple batches at different fermentation stages while monitoring environmental conditions that could affect wine quality during the vulnerable months-long brewing process. Remember those yeast cultures you've been carefully maintaining? The recipe success depends entirely on yeast health and activity levels, since weak or contaminated cultures produce incomplete fermentation that creates unstable wine prone to spoilage, off flavors, or insufficient alcohol content that fails to meet customer expectations for premium wedding beverages. The Orthodox priest arrives at dawn carrying blessed candles and holy water as your precious honey wine undergoes the sacred purification rituals that transform fermented forest honey into matrimonial wine worthy of sealing divine marriage contracts sanctified by God and recognized by medieval Russian society. Father Dimitri's weathered hands trace ancient blessing patterns over clay vessels that bubble with months of careful brewing, while incense smoke mingles with fermentation aromas to create an atmosphere where spiritual devotion meets practical chemistry in ceremonies that have consecrated wedding wines for centuries. The blessing ceremony begins with prayers that invoke Saint Bartholomew, patron saint of beekeepers, asking for divine protection over the honey wine during its final maturation period while ensuring the beverage will bring fertility, prosperity, and marital happiness to couples who share it during their wedding celebrations. Medieval Russian Orthodox theology viewed honey wine as a sacred substance that participated in the divine mystery of marriage, making proper blessing essential for wines intended to sanctify lifelong unions between Christian families. Father Dimitri examines each fermentation vessel with the careful attention of a quality control expert, since contaminated or improperly fermented wine could not receive sacred blessing and would be rejected for use in Orthodox wedding ceremonies. The Church developed sophisticated criteria for evaluating honey wine quality that included not just taste and aroma, but mysterious spiritual indicators that experienced priests claimed to detect through prayer and contemplation. Here's where medieval religious wine blessing gets genuinely complex. Different grades of honey wine required different blessing ceremonies that reflected their intended use in wedding celebrations. Simple blessings sufficed for wines served during reception festivities, while honey wine intended for the actual matrimonial toast required elaborate purification rituals that could take hours to complete and involved multiple priests working in carefully coordinated ceremonies. The holy water addition process involved precise measurements that enhanced honey wine's spiritual properties without compromising fermentation or flavor development. Too much holy water diluted the wine's alcohol content and altered its taste profile, while too little failed to provide adequate sanctification for use in sacred wedding ceremonies where spiritual purity was considered as important as beverage quality. Medieval Russian Orthodox priests also conducted exorcism rituals over honey wine intended for particularly important weddings, since evil spirits were believed capable of contaminating precious beverages and cursing marriages before they even began. These spiritual cleansing ceremonies involved prayers, incense, and mysterious procedures that supposedly eliminated malevolent influences while strengthening the wine's beneficial effects on marital happiness and family prosperity. The timing of blessing ceremonies had to coordinate with fermentation schedules and wedding dates, creating complex logistical challenges that required careful planning months in advance. Wine blessed too early might lose its sanctification during extended storage, while last-minute blessing ceremonies risked incomplete purification that could compromise the spiritual efficacy of wedding celebrations. Quality standards for blessed honey wine were remarkably strict, since the Orthodox Church refused to sanctify beverages that failed to meet theological criteria for purity, proper preparation, and spiritual worthiness. Rejected wine batches represented catastrophic financial losses for brewers who had invested months of dangerous work and expensive ingredients in production that ultimately proved unsuitable for sacred use. The blessing documentation process involved detailed record-keeping that tracked which honey wine batches had received proper sanctification, when blessing ceremonies were performed, and which priests had conducted the rituals. This paperwork was essential for wedding planning, since couples needed proof that their matrimonial wine had received adequate spiritual preparation for use in Orthodox ceremonies. Father Dimitri also evaluates the spiritual worthiness of the brewing process itself, since honey wine produced through dishonest means, stolen ingredients, or unethical business practices could not receive church blessing regardless of beverage quality. Medieval Orthodox theology held that spiritual contamination during production rendered honey wine unsuitable for sacred use, creating additional quality control requirements beyond simple fermentation success. The purification rituals conclude with special storage blessings that protect sanctified honey wine from spiritual contamination during the weeks or months between blessing and actual wedding consumption. These protective ceremonies involve sealing blessed wine containers with holy wax, placing religious icons nearby, and conducting periodic re-blessing rituals that maintain spiritual purity until wedding celebrations. Historians still argue whether the elaborate honey wine blessing ceremonies reflected genuine theological requirements or represented church efforts to control and tax luxury beverage production through religious oversight. What's certain is that properly blessed honey wine commanded significantly higher prices than secular varieties, creating powerful economic incentives for brewers to seek religious sanctification regardless of their personal spiritual convictions. The blessed honey wine also received special handling requirements that prevented contamination with ordinary beverages or exposure to spiritually unclean conditions that could nullify the sanctification and require expensive re-blessing ceremonies. You're managing storage, transportation, and serving procedures that maintain spiritual purity while protecting valuable wine from physical spoilage or damage. Regional variations in blessing ceremonies reflected different Orthodox traditions and local customs that had evolved over centuries of honey wine production, creating distinctive styles of sanctified beverages that connoisseurs could identify by taste and spiritual effect. Northern monasteries produced honey wine with particularly potent blessing reputations, while southern regions specialized in delicate ceremonial varieties preferred for diplomatic weddings. Remember that sacred recipe you followed so carefully during fermentation? The blessing ceremony validates months of technical precision and dangerous ingredient gathering, transforming your forest honey into matrimonial wine that will soon seal marriage contracts between noble families who trust their family honor to your brewing expertise and Father Dimitri's spiritual authority. The wedding feast preparation transforms your monastery brewing operation into a medieval Russian logistics nightmare, as you coordinate the massive honey wine production needed to supply 3-day wedding celebrations that could host anywhere from 50 to 500 guests depending on the family's social status and political connections. You're suddenly responsible for calculating precise beverage quantities, managing storage logistics, and coordinating delivery schedules that must align with complex wedding timeline requirements, while ensuring every drop of precious honey wine maintains its blessed purity and optimal flavor profile. Wedding feast logistics begin months before the actual ceremony as families negotiate guest lists, ceremonial requirements, and honey wine specifications that reflect their social aspirations and financial capabilities. Noble weddings demand enormous quantities of premium honey wine that could require harvesting honey from dozens of forest territories, while merchant families might settle for smaller batches of high-quality wine supplemented with less expensive fermented beverages that still meet Orthodox blessing requirements. You're managing production schedules that must account for seasonal honey availability, fermentation timing, blessing ceremony coordination, and storage capacity limitations that could derail months of careful planning if any single element fails to align properly. Medieval Russian wedding seasons concentrated during specific months when Orthodox calendar restrictions allowed marriage ceremonies, creating intense demand spikes that strained brewing operations and drove honey wine prices to astronomical levels. The quantity calculations require sophisticated mathematical skills as you estimate consumption rates based on guest demographics, celebration duration, and regional drinking customs that varied significantly across medieval Russian territories. Boyar weddings might consume 2 gallons of honey wine per guest over 3 days of festivities, while peasant celebrations made smaller quantities stretched through careful rationing and dilution with blessed water that maintained spiritual purity while reducing alcohol content. Storage logistics become nightmarish as your blessed honey wine inventory grows beyond your monastery's cellar capacity, forcing you to negotiate temporary storage arrangements with allied monasteries, wealthy merchants, or noble families who possess adequate underground facilities. Moving large quantities of fragile pottery vessels filled with precious honey wine across medieval Russian roads presents logistical challenges that make modern supply chain management look simple by comparison. Quality control becomes exponentially more complex as production scales increase, since every batch must maintain the exacting standards required for blessed wedding wine while meeting delivery deadlines that allow no margin for error or contamination disasters. You're conducting daily taste tests, monitoring fermentation progress across dozens of vessels, and managing temperature controls in multiple storage locations scattered across the regional territory. The transportation planning involves coordinating ox cart convoys, river barge shipments, and sledge deliveries depending on seasonal conditions and wedding venue locations that might be days of dangerous travel from your brewing facilities. Medieval Russian roads were notorious for destroying cargo, while river transport risked contamination from flooding or boat accidents that could destroy months of irreplaceable work in minutes of catastrophic misfortune. Here's where wedding logistics get seriously complicated. You're managing simultaneous brewing operations for multiple families whose wedding dates might conflict, creating resource allocation challenges that require diplomatic skills rivaling those of medieval Russian ambassadors. Wealthy families expect exclusive access to your finest honey wine, while maintaining relationships with regular customers whose repeat business sustains your monastery's brewing operations throughout the year. Labor management becomes critical as honey wine production scales beyond what regular monastery brothers can handle, forcing you to recruit seasonal workers whose skill levels and spiritual worthiness must meet orthodox standards for handling blessed beverages. Training temporary workers in complex fermentation procedures while maintaining security around proprietary brewing techniques creates management challenges that would challenge modern corporate executives. The financial planning involves managing advance payments, ingredient procurement costs, and cash flow requirements that could bankrupt your monastery if wedding celebrations are cancelled or postponed due to political upheavals, family disputes, or seasonal disasters that frequently disrupted medieval Russian social plans. Wedding contracts typically required substantial deposits, but final payments depended on successful delivery of properly blessed honey wine that met exacting quality specifications. Backup planning becomes essential as you develop contingency strategies for equipment failures, ingredient shortages, contamination disasters, or political events that could disrupt carefully coordinated production schedules. Medieval Russian politics were notoriously unstable, and noble families involved in brewing contracts might suddenly find themselves in exile, prison, or worse situations that left monastery brewers holding enormous inventories of specialized honey wine with no buyers. Historians still argue whether the elaborate wedding feast logistics represented genuine celebration requirements or reflected conspicuous consumption designed to demonstrate family wealth and political power through extravagant honey wine displays. Archaeological evidence suggests some medieval Russian weddings consumed honey wine quantities that would challenge modern industrial breweries, while creating waste streams that contaminated local water supplies and created public health hazards. Remember that blessing ceremony Father Dmitri just completed? Those sanctified vessels now become the foundation of a logistical operation that rivals military campaign planning in complexity, requiring coordination between multiple monasteries, transportation networks, and storage facilities that must all maintain spiritual purity while delivering thousands of gallons of precious honey wine to wedding celebrations across medieval Russian territories. The final logistics challenge involves coordinating your honey wine delivery with wedding feast preparation timelines that require precise synchronization between multiple food preparation teams, serving staff, and ceremonial officials who all depend on your brewing expertise to provide the matrimonial wine that will seal marriage contracts and launch family alliances that might influence regional politics for generations. The wedding ceremony reaches its climactic moment as you watch centuries of honey wine tradition culminate in the sacred toast that will legally and spiritually bind two medieval Russian families through matrimonial contracts sealed with the precious fermented honey you've spent months perfecting in monastery cellars under orthodox blessing and careful temperature control. The bride and groom approach the altar where Father Dmitri holds aloft the ceremonial chalice filled with your golden honey wine that glows like liquid sunlight in the flickering candlelight of the ancient wooden church decorated with icons and incense smoke. The ceremonial chalice itself represents months of careful preparation, since Orthodox wedding traditions required specific vessels crafted from blessed materials and decorated with religious symbols that enhance the spiritual power of matrimonial honey wine. Master craftsmen carved intricate designs into precious metals or specially selected hardwoods, creating chalices that cost more than many families earned in entire years while serving as heirloom treasures passed between generations of wedding celebrations. You observe the precise ritual choreography as Father Dmitri blesses the honey wine one final time before the matrimonial toast, invoking prayers that transform your fermented forest honey into a sacramental beverage capable of binding souls together through divine authority recognized by medieval Russian law and Orthodox theology. The Church developed elaborate ceremonial procedures that govern every aspect of wedding wine consumption, from blessing prayers to sip timing that determined the spiritual efficacy of marriage contracts. The bride takes the first sip of honey wine while reciting ancient vows that pledge her family's honor, dowry, and bloodline to the marriage alliance being sealed through this sacred toast that represents far more than romantic celebration. Medieval Russian marriages were primarily political and economic arrangements between families, with the honey wine serving as both legal witness and spiritual catalyst that transformed individual lives into unified family entities recognized by church and state authority. Here's where the wedding toast becomes genuinely dramatic. The groom must drain the entire chalice of honey wine without pausing, since hesitation or inability to finish the ceremonial drink was interpreted as divine disapproval of the marriage contract and could nullify the entire wedding ceremony. The alcohol content of properly fermented honey wine made this requirement seriously challenging, especially for young men unaccustomed to consuming strong beverages during high-stress ceremonial situations. The wedding guests participate in the honey wine ceremony through carefully orchestrated toasting sequences that follow strict social hierarchy protocols reflecting medieval Russian class distinctions and family alliances. Noble relatives receive premium honey wine served in precious chalices, while merchants and peasants share communal vessels filled with slightly diluted versions that maintain spiritual purity while acknowledging economic realities of wedding feast logistics. The legal significance of the honey wine toast extends beyond religious ceremony, since medieval Russian marriage contracts weren't considered valid until both parties had consumed blessed matrimonial wine in the presence of Orthodox priests and community witnesses. This requirement created enormous pressure for wedding planners to ensure adequate honey wine supplies, since running out of blessed beverage during ceremonies could invalidate marriage contracts and create legal disasters for families involved. The ceremonial timing must coordinate perfectly with Orthodox liturgical requirements that dictated specific moments when matrimonial honey wine could be consumed during wedding services. Too early and the toast lacked proper spiritual preparation. Too late, and it interfered with other ceremonial elements that comprised the complex wedding liturgy developed over centuries of Orthodox tradition. Regional variations in wedding toast customs created distinctive honey wine consumption patterns that reflected local traditions and family preferences passed down through generations of marriage celebrations. Northern territories favored strong, barely diluted honey wine that tested the groom's endurance, while southern regions preferred sweeter, more palatable versions that emphasized celebration over masculine challenge. The political implications of wedding honey wine become apparent as family alliances are literally cemented through shared consumption of blessed beverages that create spiritual bonds between previously separate kinship groups. Medieval Russian politics operated through complex marriage networks, making wedding toasts critically important diplomatic events that could shift regional power balances through successful matrimonial alliances. Quality control reaches its ultimate test as your months of careful brewing face public evaluation by wedding guests whose social status and refined palates demand honey wine that meets exacting standards for flavor, aroma, and spiritual potency. A single contaminated batch or failed fermentation could humiliate your monastery's brewing reputation and cost lucrative future contracts with noble families who expect perfection in their ceremonial beverages. The symbolic significance of honey wine in medieval Russian culture reflects ancient Slavic beliefs about honey's magical properties and its connection to fertility, prosperity, and divine blessing that made it the ideal substance for sealing marriage contracts between families seeking supernatural protection for their newly united bloodlines. Honey represented the sweetness of marital happiness while wine symbolized the intoxication of love, creating a perfect ceremonial beverage for wedding celebrations. Historians still argue whether the elaborate wedding toast ceremonies reflected genuine spiritual beliefs or represented social theater designed to impress guests and demonstrate family wealth through expensive honey wine displays. Archaeological evidence suggests some medieval Russian weddings consumed honey wine quantities that would challenge modern wedding reception budgets, while creating memorable celebrations that guests discussed for years afterward. Remember that sacred fermentation process you mastered in monastery cellars? The wedding toast represents the culmination of dangerous forest honey gathering, complex brewing procedures, and months of careful aging that transforms wild forest products into matrimonial wine capable of sealing family alliances that might influence regional politics for generations of future descendants. The ceremony concludes with communal honey wine sharing that extends the matrimonial blessing to all wedding guests, creating spiritual bonds between families and communities that strengthen social networks through shared consumption of blessed beverages. You watch as your precious honey wine disappears into dozens of throats, knowing that each sip carries months of your expertise and devotion into the bodies and souls of medieval Russian families celebrating new beginnings. The brutal Russian winter descends like a frozen curtain across your monastery, as you face the critical challenge of preserving thousands of gallons of precious honey wine through months of temperatures that regularly plummet to -40 degrees while maintaining the delicate fermentation balance and blessed purity required for spring wedding celebrations that depend entirely on your storage expertise and medieval preservation techniques. Your underground cellars become survival chambers where liquid gold must endure nature's harshest assault without freezing solid, spoiling from temperature fluctuations, or losing the complex flavor profiles that distinguish premium matrimonial wine from ordinary fermented beverages. Winter storage begins with elaborate insulation procedures that transform your monastery cellars into medieval Russian versions of modern climate-controlled warehouses, using layers of straw, animal fur, and specially designed stone barriers that maintain stable temperatures despite the apocalyptic weather conditions raging above ground. You're essentially building primitive refrigeration systems using materials available in medieval Russian forests, creating storage environments that protect delicate honey wine from both freezing damage and unwanted secondary fermentation that could ruin months of careful brewing work. The pottery vessels containing your precious honey wine require individual protection systems that prevent thermal shock from rapid temperature changes that could crack clay containers and destroy irreplaceable inventory worth more than most peasant families earn in entire lifetimes. You wrap each vessel in multiple layers of wool and linen, creating insulation cocoons that buffer against temperature fluctuations while allowing continued slow fermentation that enhances honey wine complexity during extended aging periods. Here's where medieval storage gets seriously technical. You're managing humidity levels that must remain high enough to prevent clay vessel deterioration, while staying low enough to prevent mold contamination that could destroy entire batches of blessed honey wine. Medieval Russian monasteries developed sophisticated moisture control techniques using charcoal filters, ventilation systems, and absorbent materials that regulated cellar environments with precision that would impress modern food preservation specialists. The aging process continues throughout winter storage as your honey wine develops deeper flavors and higher alcohol content through slow fermentation that transforms simple forest honey into complex matrimonial beverages worthy of noble wedding celebrations. Extended aging creates premium honey wine varieties that command astronomical prices from wealthy families seeking the finest possible ceremonial beverages for politically important marriage alliances. Quality monitoring becomes exponentially more challenging during winter months when cellar access requires navigating through snowdrifts and ice formations that could trap unwary monks underground for days if weather conditions deteriorate rapidly. You're conducting weekly taste tests and fermentation checks in underground chambers where a single misstep could result in death from hypothermia or carbon dioxide poisoning from fermentation gases accumulating in poorly ventilated spaces. The inventory management requires detailed record-keeping that tracks which honey wine batches are aging optimally, which vessels show signs of contamination or spoilage, and which storage locations maintain the most stable environmental conditions throughout the brutal winter months. Medieval monasteries developed complex cataloging systems that rival modern warehouse management in their attention to detail and organizational sophistication. Transportation logistics during winter months become virtually impossible as roads disappear under snow and rivers freeze solid, creating supply chain challenges that force monastery brewers to maintain enormous inventories that must last through months of complete isolation from outside markets. You're essentially operating a medieval Russian version of strategic petroleum reserves, holding massive honey wine stocks that could determine regional wedding celebration success for the entire spring season. The financial implications of winter storage create enormous risks for monastery brewing operations, since spoiled or contaminated honey wine represents catastrophic losses that could bankrupt religious communities that have invested their entire annual budget in honey wine production. Medieval Russian monasteries developed insurance arrangements and mutual aid agreements that provided backup support when storage disasters destroyed precious inventory. Security concerns multiplied during winter months as desperate bandits and starving peasants might attempt to raid monastery cellars seeking valuable honey wine that could be traded for food or shelter during harsh weather conditions. You're managing armed guards and defensive preparations that protect honey wine inventory while maintaining the peaceful monastic atmosphere required for continued spiritual operations. The heating systems for cellar maintenance require constant attention as wood fires must burn continuously throughout winter months to prevent honey wine from freezing solid while avoiding overheating that could accelerate fermentation beyond optimal parameters. Medieval Russian monks developed sophisticated heating techniques using underground chimney systems and radiant heating methods that maintained stable temperatures with minimal fuel consumption. Regional climate variations across medieval Russian territories created different storage challenges that required specialized techniques adapted to local winter conditions. Northern monasteries dealt with permafrost issues that required deeper cellars and more elaborate insulation systems, while southern facilities faced freeze-thaw cycles that created different preservation challenges requiring alternative storage strategies. Historians still argue whether the elaborate winter storage techniques represented genuine preservation necessity or reflected monastery efforts to create artificial scarcity that drove honey wine prices higher during spring wedding seasons. Archaeological evidence suggests some medieval Russian monasteries maintained underground storage facilities that rival modern industrial cold storage in their sophistication and capacity. Remember that sacred wedding toast ceremony where your honey wine sealed marriage contracts? The winter storage period represents the final test of brewing expertise as months of careful temperature control and preservation techniques determine whether your precious inventory will emerge from winter hibernation ready for spring wedding celebrations or will have deteriorated into expensive vinegar unsuitable for ceremonial use. The psychological challenge of winter storage creates enormous stress for monastery brewers who must trust their preservation techniques through months of uncertainty when contamination or spoilage could destroy their entire annual production without warning. You're living with the constant awareness that every decision about heating, ventilation, and inventory management could determine the success or failure of your monastery's brewing reputation. The spring thaw reveals the success or catastrophic failure of your winter preservation efforts as you descend into monastery cellars to discover whether months of careful temperature control and medieval storage techniques have transformed your precious honey wine into liquid perfection or expensive disappointment that could destroy generations of brewing reputation built through decades of dangerous forest work and spiritual devotion. The moment of truth arrives as you lift pottery vessels that have survived brutal Russian winter conditions, examining clarity, aroma, and taste that will determine whether your monastery's honey wine legacy continues into another generation of wedding celebrations or ends in financial ruin and professional disgrace. Your hands tremble slightly as you pour the first samples of winter-aged honey wine, watching golden liquid catch morning sunlight streaming through cellar windows while praying that months of preservation have enhanced rather than destroyed the complex flavors that distinguish premium matrimonial wine from ordinary fermented beverages. The aging process has either created magnificent honey wine worthy of the most prestigious noble weddings or produced expensive vinegar suitable only for monastery cleaning supplies and spiritual penance. The taste evaluation begins with careful examination of color, clarity, and bouquet that reveal whether winter storage has maintained the delicate balance between continued fermentation and preservation that creates truly exceptional honey wine. Properly aged medieval honey wine develops deep amber hues and complex aromatic profiles that combine forest honey sweetness with subtle fermentation notes and mysterious flavor elements that modern food scientists still struggle to identify or replicate using contemporary brewing techniques. Here's where your brewing legacy faces its ultimate test. Every noble family booking spring wedding celebrations depends on your honey wine meeting the exacting standards that have made your monastery's reputation throughout medieval Russian territories. A single contaminated batch or failed preservation could cascade into dozens of ruined wedding ceremonies, angry customers demanding refunds, and political complications that might close your brewing operation permanently while destroying centuries of monastic honey wine tradition. The cultural significance of your brewing achievement extends far beyond simple beverage production, as you've helped preserve ancient Slavic traditions that connect medieval Russian families to their pre-Christian ancestors who viewed honey wine as sacred substance capable of invoking supernatural blessings on marriage ceremonies. Your monastery has become a living repository of brewing knowledge that bridges pagan forest spirituality with Orthodox Christian wedding theology through the mysterious alchemy of fermented honey. The economic impact of successful honey wine production ripples through medieval Russian society, as your monastery's brewing operations support not just religious communities but entire networks of honey gatherers, pottery makers, transportation workers, and wedding celebration specialists whose livelihoods depend on continued demand for premium matrimonial beverages. Your brewing expertise has created employment opportunities for dozens of families while generating tax revenue that supports regional government operations. The technological achievement represented by medieval Russian honey wine production rivals contemporary brewing sophistication in its complexity and precision, demonstrating that pre-industrial societies possess scientific knowledge and practical skills that modern food production specialists are only beginning to appreciate and understand. Your monastery has preserved brewing techniques that combine chemistry, biology, and engineering in ways that challenge assumptions about medieval technological capabilities. The spiritual dimension of honey wine brewing reflects the deep integration of practical skills with religious devotion that characterized medieval monastery life, where manual labor and spiritual practice combined to create products that served both earthly needs and divine purposes. Your brewing work has been simultaneously industrial production and religious meditation, creating honey wine that carries both nutritional value and spiritual blessing into wedding celebrations across medieval Russian territories. The seasonal rhythm of honey wine production has connected your monastery to natural cycles of forest life, bee behavior, and agricultural timing that modern industrial societies have largely abandoned in favor of year-round production schedules that ignore environmental realities. Your brewing calendar follows ancient patterns that respect ecological relationships between human communities and forest ecosystems that sustained medieval Russian civilization. The social networks created through honey wine production have strengthened connections between monastery communities and secular society, creating relationships that support both religious institutions and family celebrations through mutually beneficial economic arrangements. Your brewing expertise has made your monastery an essential participant in regional social life rather than an isolated religious community disconnected from worldly concerns. Historians still argue whether medieval Russian honey wine brewing represented sophisticated food science or fortunate accident that produced exceptional beverages through trial and error experimentation rather than systematic understanding of fermentation chemistry. What's certain is that your monastery's honey wine has influenced centuries of wedding celebrations while preserving brewing knowledge that connects contemporary Russian culture to its medieval foundations. Remember that first dangerous climb into forest bee colonies where this entire journey began. Your honey wine legacy represents the transformation of raw forest resources into cultural treasures that have sweetened marriage celebrations, strengthened family alliances, and preserved ancient traditions through centuries of political upheaval and social change that might otherwise have destroyed these precious connections to medieval Russian heritage. The final evaluation of your winter-preserved honey wine determines not just this season's wedding celebration success but the continuation of brewing traditions that have survived Mongol invasions, religious persecution, political revolution, and cultural transformation while maintaining their essential character and spiritual significance. You're tasting liquid history that carries the essence of medieval Russian civilization in every precious drop. The soft glow of monastery candles flickers against ancient stone walls as your honey wine journey draws to its gentle close, the golden liquid catching light like captured sunbeams that have traveled through centuries of Russian winters to reach this peaceful moment. Your breathing slows naturally as you imagine the sweet aroma of fermented forest honey drifting through quiet cellars where time moves differently, where seasons blend into each other like colors in an old painting, and where the gentle bubbling of fermentation creates nature's own lullaby. The monastery bells chime softly in the distance, their bronze voices carrying across snow-covered courtyards where monks once walked in contemplative silence, their footsteps muffled by winter's gentle blanket. You can almost taste the honeyed wine on your lips, that perfect balance of sweetness and warmth that has blessed countless wedding celebrations and sealed marriages that bloomed into love stories written in the stars above medieval Russian forests. Your eyelids grow heavy as you drift deeper into this timeless place where ancient traditions whisper their secrets to those patient enough to listen, where every drop of precious honey wine carries within it the wisdom of forest bees, the devotion of monastery brewers, and the joy of couples who found their happily ever after in shared sips of liquid gold. The world grows quieter now, softer, as these gentle voices from the past fade into dreams where honey flows like rivers and love stories never end.